Hey everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of the 1044, a new weekly webisode and podcast from the editors here at CCJ, Overdrive, and Truck Parts Service. I'm James Gillette, and my co-host on the other side is Jason Cannon, editor of CCJ. We'll be hitting YouTube, social media, and your preferred podcast listening app each week with a new episode of the 1044. So go ahead and subscribe to CCJ's YouTube channel if you haven't already, and find the 1044 in your favorite podcast app and subscribe there too. So we are recording this the day after the election, and I didn't sleep well last night.
I probably beat you. I like you. I had the news queued up and everything else, and it doesn't really feel like it's the day after the election because we still really don't know who won, and then there's going to be that inevitable contesting or voter fraud claims. To your point about going to bed, I actually cashed out last night. When Trump was up about minus 270 as a betting favorite. I got really tired of watching CNN and NBC, so I did the next logical thing, which is, you just watch the offshore betting odds. Up minus 270, at that point, I was fairly satisfied that it was over. And the last time I checked about 2 hours, about 2 hours ago, it's now Biden minus about 475, and he's been climbing all morning. So if you voted Democrat, you're probably feeling pretty good right now, whereas you might have been a little bit more pessimistic when you went to bed last night.
Yeah, I think this episode will drop sometime Thursday, and so there will probably be a lot more information about results from those key swing states when this episode comes out. So time for our main segment this morning, Under the Hood. This week, we're talking the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, and there's so much that we could dive into on this topic, but the chief area of concern right now is that fleets and owner-operators have just 2 months left before the January 5th, 2021 deadline to run their required annual queries. So fleets and owner-operators, independent owner-operators, are all required to make an annual query in the clearinghouse of all their drivers every year, and that's a limited query, not the full query like when you're hiring a driver. And so far, only 145,000 carriers have registered within the clearinghouse, and that is well shy of the 550,000 motor carriers with operating authority that presumably will need to register before that January 5th, 2021 deadline and run their queries. I talked to a few compliance outfits this week and looked at the numbers put out by FMCSA in their monthly reports about the clearinghouse. And it looks like there's still a huge wave of fleets that haven't logged into the system to register, let alone run their annual query. And the big question currently is, can FMCSA's platform hold up to another rush in traffic? Earlier this year, when the clearinghouse rule took effect in January, and fleets were required to start using it when they were hiring drivers, a rush of new users caused the system to crash and then caused weeks of instability after that while FMCSA tried to patch up the software. And as one compliance expert told me recently, despite FMCSA beefing up that platform, the tech behind the platform, it still really hasn't been tested since that initial January rush. And so we have just right at 8 weeks remaining for the rest of the 400,000 or so motor carriers that have not registered to register and make their annual queries. So it's really kind of up in the air, Jason, as to whether the system can hold up to that kind of stress.
Yeah, and not to keep hammering the election, but I think we're kind of seeing right now what a stress test can do to a system. So to your point, we may just have to stay tuned. Interestingly enough, the clearinghouse wasn't rated in ATRI's most recent annual Top 10 Trucking Industry Issues survey, unless you consider that a contributor to the driver shortage, which was the top concern. But making that connection seems to me a little bit of a stretch. If you're leaving the industry over more rigid drug testing standards, then I think you really need to be gone anyway. You mentioned you had spoken to some compliance experts, and I've spoken to some fleets who were early adopters of hair testing. That's not exactly the same thing, but in some of those cases, those tests are catching 9 to 10 times as many drivers as compared to urine. So follow along here with me. We're talking a couple of different things here. But if those carriers were, those carriers were also in the clearinghouse fairly early, and they're putting more drivers into the system because these tests are catching more drivers. And as more carriers migrate toward hair testing, even if they see an increased failure rate, maybe it's not 9 times, maybe it's not 10 times more, but you're going to have more companies in the clearinghouse itself, and they're going to be putting more drivers through it.
Right. Yeah. And we're seeing in these monthly reports from FMCSA, there's so much data in there, and there's so much compelling data around the number of drivers that have failed a drug test, the types of drugs that they're failing tests for. And so, I think there's plenty more to dive into on the clearinghouse aspect in the coming weeks and months. And this is something, Jason, I'm interested in. I'm trying to track down. I think I've seen it somewhere, but I haven't been able to find it again. I'm really curious as to what FMCSA paid to build that clearinghouse platform. I'm sure it was a not inexpensive government contractor that built it, and I'm not dumping on them necessarily, but they knew how many fleets were out there, and they knew how many would have to register in the clearinghouse. Yet right out of the gate in January, it couldn't withstand the initial rush of traffic that came with the implementation of the whole platform and the rule itself. And so I'm interested to see whether the system can hold up in the next couple of weeks. I think most immediately with the clearinghouse, that's what we'll be looking at. And then I think longer term, those issues that you were talking about come into play around, the number of drivers that are showing up in the clearinghouse and thus not able to be employed until they go through the return to duty process, and what impact that might have on the driver pool. So switching gears to our next segment, on to mailbag, Jason. We've got a question here that came in from Facebook, and I'm going to pitch it over to you. If my truck weighs less than 26,001 pounds and I'm required to keep a log, am I also required to do a pre-trip inspection?
The 2601 is basically the CDL threshold. So the FMCSA doesn't really tie performance of the inspection itself to weight, rather than the fact that it's a commercial vehicle. So assuming that this person or the vehicle has a DOT number, and since they have an ELD, they should. My answer is that they do have to perform a pre-trip inspection, and they are not exempt from that just because the vehicle falls up under a certain weight. They are subject to perform a pre-trip inspection based on the fact that it is a commercial vehicle used for interstate commerce.
Thanks, Jason, for clearing that one up. Maybe the reader who put that out on Facebook will give this a listen and know the answer to the question. And so I have sort of a little bit of a twist on a mailbag question that I got recently, and props to trucker Todd McCann, who emailed a few weeks ago with this question that he had about hours of service. I think it was our first or second episode. We went into a couple of Q&As on what was happening with hours of service. So Todd emailed and asked on October 11th. He said he did not have a sleeper berth. He runs a day cab truck, but he wanted to use the split sleeper berth options anyways that are available under the new hours of service regulations, and he asked if he could. And I guess I was a little too slow to get back with him on that, because he emailed me back this week saying he had found his own answer, and the answer is yes, he can use the split sleeper berth options even if he doesn't have a sleeper berth on his truck, because even though the longer split of the two splits under the new hours of service regulations, and I think we're getting in the weeds here, so I'll just clarify. Remember that all of the pairs in the hours of service regulations splits have to be qualifying pairs. You have to pair a longer brake with a shorter brake. The longer brake requires technically the driver be in the sleeper berth or be in sleeper berth mode to remain compliant. But Todd McCann, the driver who sent this question in, said he ran a few tests with his ELD, and he did some homework and found out that yes, even if you don't have a sleeper on your truck and you run a day cab, you can still split your hours, since the first split, which is the one he wanted to use to pause his 14-hour clock essentially, only has to be taken in off-duty mode and not sleeper berth mode. So there you go. My apologies if that was too in the weeds. And if you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming mailbag, please email us at 1044trucking@gmail.com or give us a call, 404-491-1380. Again, that's 1044trucking@gmail.com, and the phone number is 404-491-1380. We really want to hear your questions and your comments, so please email us or give us a call, and we'll try to include your question in an upcoming mailbag. All right, Jason, now turning to our final segment of this episode, roadside attractions. My question for you is, if a dump truck is swerving in your lane and you avoid said dump truck but hit a tree limb on the side of the road doing so, and you were a fleet manager, would you flag that driver for a preventable crash?
Let's see. The FMCSR defines a preventable accident as one in which the driver failed to do everything that they reasonably could to avoid the accident. So in this case, I would say the driver did everything that they could, and he wouldn't have had the foresight to know that the truck was going to swerve into his or her lane. So I'm going to say this was a non-preventable accident, and I'm also going to thank this driver for avoiding a potential head-on collision or a potential sideswipe.
Yeah, if it was my fleet, I would almost pat the guy on the back and say, I'd rather you bump the tree limb on the side of the road than take one for the team on a head-on. But nonetheless, you can find the answer to that preventable or not scenario on CCJ. Go to ccjdigital.com and search preventable. You can see all of our preventable or not scenarios and the outcomes in video format on CCJ. There's plenty there. I think a couple dozen at this point. Jason, you've got a trip coming up next week out to the West Coast, I believe, to drive the new Western Star. Does that sound right?
That is absolutely right. I am ridiculously excited. This will be my first test drive since, I believe, March. And it's a new model, so it's always fun to get in. It's fun to get in the equipment itself, but when it's a new truck with a new transmission, lots of really cool, interesting things to buttons to push and gadgets to play with. So yeah, I'm big time excited. I hope to have a recap of that drive on ccjdigital.com late next week, and I look forward to talking with you about it. Maybe Thursday evening, Thursday afternoon. Now, that may have to take place in the airport, but I'm down for it if you are.
Hey man, I'm in, and I think we can make that work. So I'm looking forward to hearing about your experience and seeing what you thought of the new Western Star. So, dear listeners, that's this edition of the 1044. Again, hit us with your mailbag questions at 1044trucking@gmail.com or give us a call 404-491-1380 and leave us a message. I check that mailbox roughly daily, so give us a call there and sound off and let us know what's on your mind. Otherwise, everybody take care, stay safe, and we'll see you next week.